Peter. You're listening to the Westminster Hour with Carolyn Quinn. Plebgate, Pastygate, double dip, recession, one nation. Words and phrases that made the political headlines in 2012. As we approach the end of the year, the coalition is still together, but the stress marks are showing. Ed Miliband has cemented his place as Labour's leader, despite failing to tell us much about how he'd do things differently if he were running the country. While the Eurozone countries discussed plans to create a fiscal and banking union, David Cameron came under continued pressure to distance the UK from the EU. And UKIP sought to profit from Tory discomfort over Europe and gay marriage. So what are the big challenges facing the leaders of our three main parties going into 2013? Well, here with me, Tim Montgomerie, editor of Conservative Home, Hopi Sen, Labour blogger and contributing editor to New Labour pressure group Progress, and on the line, Lib Dem blogger Stephen Tall, editor of Liberal Democrat Voice. Welcome to all of you. We were going to sort of talk about general issues, but I think we have to start with the Andrew Mitchell affair. Tim, his fight back is really intensifying now, isn't it? He claims he was the victim of a deliberate attempt to toxify the Tories and ruin his career. He's obviously got issues with the police, but what about David Cameron? Does he feel that he was let down by the Prime Minister?
I'm not entirely sure whether Andrew Mitchell feels let down by the Prime Minister in particular, but I think there is a feeling amongst Camp Mitchell that they were certainly let down by the number 10 machine. When David Davis, Andrew Mitchell's friend, went to look at the CCTV, they came to the pretty rapid conclusion that the police log couldn't have been accurate and trustworthy because the several passers-by referred to in the log clearly did not exist on the CCTV. And the allegation is that Sir Jeremy Hayward, the chief civil servant in number 10, rather than sort of a Sherlock Holmes operation, this was more Inspector Clouseau. That's sort of what Mitchell friends are saying. Now, is that coded criticism of the Prime Minister? I don't necessarily think so, but certainly Andrew Mitchell was not well served.
A victim of collusion, David Davis says. Stephen, do you think this was, as he said, maybe a conspiracy aimed at doing harm?
I don't know about a conspiracy. I think what there was here was a rush to judgment. And actually, I think a lot of people can take their share of the blame for that. That's the number 10 operation that Tim was talking about just then, but also the media. You had The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph all rushing in to put the boot into Andrew Mitchell, even though the facts now seem to bear out his account more than the police's. And of course, you have the public as well. Polls taken shortly after the incident in September showed that 2/3 of the public believed the police rather than the politician. And what we now find out is, perhaps unsurprisingly to some of us, that the police, whilst doing a magnificent job most of the time, are flawed like anyone else. So I think there's a bit for all of us to reflect on about this.
Ed Miliband obviously was one of those who did jump on the bandwagon, didn't he? Because there were jibes against Andrew Mitchell in PMQs as well. Yvette Cooper used her conference speech to poke fun at him and play up the idea of him being a toff. Do you think, Hopi, that now that this case against Andrew Mitchell is unravelling, will voters perhaps be more sceptical about these sort of class attacks that are being using class as a method of attack?
I don't think on Andrew Mitchell it will make much of a difference at all, because the truth of what drives the class attack against the Conservative Party is what's happening on taxation, on the economy. It's the fact that people are having benefits and tax credits cut while millionaires are getting tax breaks. I think that's the meat of that attack. On the Andrew Mitchell side of things, I'm just glad that we finally converted David Davis to support CCTV in the surveillance state. I mean, it's wonderful. So it's a Christmas present all round.
But people were quite quick. I mean, Yvette Cooper did make great play out of what Andrew Mitchell was supposed to have said during her conference speech. Are you saying that it was natural for people to make...
I think when you're at a point which there's no one's quite clear whether Andrew Mitchell was really denying saying what he said. He'd said he'd sworn at the police. He'd said said something, but wasn't quite clear what he wasn't said.
And he's admitted today that he really made a hash of his apology, basically.
So I think on that basis that it's fairly reasonable for any opposition politician to make a political point out of that.
Talking of apologies, Stephen, Nick Clegg's apology, obviously a big moment of 2012. We go into 2013 with the coalition still together, but your leader saying he wants to see more of the inner workings and how he is influencing coalition policy on show. Now, we've all heard this saying about politics, haven't we? Laws are like sausages, but it's just best not to see them being made. Nick Clegg wants us, though, to see more of how the sausages are made. Won't the public say, well, look, if you're so unhappy with the Conservatives and you want to show off how different you are, why on earth are you in coalition with them?
Yeah, in a sense, I wish the coalition were a bit more like sausages, because they're quite popular at this time of year, certainly more so than the coalition is. I think what he's trying to say is, look, you had a coalition under New Labour of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who were at each other's throats the whole time. What you've got under a coalition of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives is a much more open, transparent way of sparring. And I think there's a greater comfort at the moment with the fact that we're both showing what we're more comfortable being. The Conservatives are showing their true colours in terms of a more right-wing agenda. The Liberal Democrats are trying to stay truer to their
And you're
liberal
happy
identity.
to push them towards the right, are you?
I don't think we're pushing them to the right. I think they're doing a very good job of sidelining themselves on their own account, rather than it being the Lib Dems pushing them there. I think what you're seeing is an attempt to try and get a mature, grown-up sense of how you do politics, which is that we're in two different political parties. Lib Dems believe one thing, Conservatives believe another. This is a business arrangement. I think the phrase that you hear a lot of is distinctive, not destructive, that we want to try and make sure that people understand, look, we're in different parties, we have different views, we've come together in a national interest, but we still have those different views on things like the economy. We share a large amount of ground that we will continue to work on, but there are going to be other issues where we keep on fighting each other. As long as we do that openly, transparently, people can see the inner workings. I think most of the British people are kind of quite comfortable with that style of governing.
What do you think, Tim? Is this friction helping?
Well, I don't think it's helping Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg has been doing this differentiation now for quite some time. This isn't a new effort by him, and his poll ratings remain flat as a pancake. Stephen talks about voters wanting to see mature, grown-up government. He's right, but the Liberal Democrats, by constantly attacking their Conservative partners, are looking self-indulgent. They're not looking like they are actually focusing on the nation's business. And I think that Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats would have been much better advised to be a more grown-up government for a period and save the politics until much nearer the election. The Conservatives, I think, are willing to let Nick Clegg carry on behaving like this because he is a useful coalition partner, but they don't expect that he will be a Liberal Democrat leader at the next election, and certainly not.
Who do they think will be then?
Well, they don't know, but what they hope who will replace Nick Clegg as some sort of Liberal Democrat, a left-leaning Liberal Democrat.
So Nick Clegg is
some sort of left-leaning Liberal Democrat who will begin to take votes back from the Labour Party. The Liberal Democrats have hemorrhaged support to Labour over the time of the coalition, and if that isn't in some way reversed, the chances of Labour winning the next election are greatly increased.
Hopi?
Well, the interesting thing about that whole discussion is that there's no shared common political project in discussion here.
Sorting out the economy.
The problem with that is that the deficit is now scheduled to be more borrowing than under Alistair Darling's plan set out in 2010. So you've got one common thing that's holding them together, and that's not working. And so given that the fundamental purpose of the coalition is really not happening, you don't have a common political project that can be seen to drive them together. Now, I think actually Nick Clegg's been let down a bit by David Cameron, because in 2010 I think Nick Clegg believed he was getting a liberal conservative type of politician, and in fact what he's got is a vacuum where a Prime Minister should be, with the intellectual strength in the Conservative Party being subcontracted to George Osborne and the political energy being all on the Tory right, and David Cameron really not doing anything to deliver that kind of liberal conservative agenda. Now, Clegg's tried to do that himself. I think Richard Reeves did a very interesting article about kind of creating a hard-headed progressive liberalism. But unfortunately, the one person who can't deliver that is Nick Clegg. He's finished politically. So if somebody else were to try and deliver that, it might actually have some political interest.
Well, Stephen, let me get your thoughts on that then. Is he finished politically? Will he be gone by 2015?
I don't think he's finished politically. I don't think any of us at the moment know whether Nick Clegg will be leader at the next election.
What do you think? What do you think?
I honestly don't know. I think a lot will depend on the next couple of years in terms of the election results. You've got local elections, obviously, coming up in May, and then obviously the Euro elections, which wouldn't normally be seen as critical, but given they're taking place in 2014, a year before the general election, and everyone's going to have their eyes on how UKIP do, then I think there'll be more than usual interest in the political plates shifting.
But before
I
all
just want to
that,
take,
you've got the spending review, haven't you? You will be fighting the next election on the same spending plans as the Conservatives, and George Osborne's already warned austerity is going to go on to 2018. Your party is going to be pretty unhappy about that, isn't it?
I think what you'll find with the spending review is that there'll be an agreed envelope, as they say, about the budget, but there'll be lots of room for differentiation for both parties' sakes. So let's take a practical example like Trident. The Conservatives will commit to spending hundreds of millions more pounds on an outdated defence system. The Liberal Democrats won't, so that would be an easy saving that could be shifted after the 2015 general election. And back to Hopi's point before about the coalition not having a common purpose. If you look at the autumn statement, George Osborne's autumn statement, what you had was the Conservatives went in wanting a freeze on welfare payments, and the Liberal Democrats arguing that that wasn't going to be fair. What you ended up with was a 1% cash rise. Now that's below inflation and it will hurt the working poor hard, but nonetheless you could see a common purpose there, which was one party saying A, another party saying B, and both parties compromising on C.
I'll talk about welfare a bit more in a moment, but Tim, just on that point of the spending review, it's a huge event for the coalition, isn't it, next year?
It's a huge event for the coalition and a huge event for the Labour Party as well. We were talking a few minutes ago about the class war attacks that Ed Miliband has been mounting on Andrew Mitchell and the Conservative Party. And that's been a substitute really for any detailed thinking from the Labour Party. This, I think, has been another wasted year for Labour. They haven't addressed the fundamental questions that they needed to do in government. They needed to show to the electorate that they could spend money responsibly, that they were sorry for the debt that they'd built up in Britain, that they'd learnt the lessons about the welfare bills that they'd failed to bring under control. And here we are, another 12 months into Ed Miliband's leadership, and we still have seen no evidence that he's really learnt the lessons of Labour's time in office. And the spending review will be another opportunity for David Cameron and George Osborne to show that Labour haven't fundamentally changed.
You're looking a little bit sceptical, it has to be said, Hopi, but obviously, at the moment, we are told Labour is not going to say what it will do because there are several years until the election. But once you've got a spending review in place, can that position hold?
It'll be much more difficult to not talk about what's happening in terms of forward fiscal framework. But let's go back to where we are now. The position is that the government is now borrowing more each year for the next 4 or 5 years than Alistair Darling was going to have borrowed. So in terms of fiscal responsibility...
You've mentioned this before. Yeah, the deficit's down by a quarter. Nearly every developed country in the world is off target because the world economy is so much more depressed.
Okay.
I think making that same point without reference to international economic conditions...
I'm perfectly willing to accept, Tim, that international economic conditions have a huge impact on the British economy, as long as you're willing to accept that means that the Conservative attack on Labour for the past 5 years is completely misguided.
No, because you left the economy in a worse state than most other countries.
The fact is, though, that whatever you're saying about that, there will come a point, surely, when you have to say how much more Labour would borrow, how much more Labour would tax, where Labour would cut. And these are the sorts of things that we are not hearing at all. Well, and these are things that you've been pretty critical of in the past, haven't you? That you're leaving your flanks exposed to an attack by the Conservatives.
I think it would be a huge mistake to anticipate the spending review. I think if you try to say, this is what we would do before the spending review, let's remember that every time we've had an OBR projection or an autumn statement, the deficit figures and the debt figures have been worse than projected. Every single time they've got worse and worse and worse. So what that means is you have to understand where you're going to be starting from. And until you know where you're going to be starting from, it would be stupid for any Shadow Chancellor to do that.
So
Having said that,
would he be able to lay out then what Labour's spending plans will be once he's seen the spending review?
I think what you first have to do is you have to say these are the areas that we prioritise. And I think you're beginning to see where that is from Labour. You'll be able to see an industrial bank and focus on infrastructure, on capital spend, on moving from programme spend to long-term investment. And I think once you've done that, you can begin to start talking about budget priorities. And I think that will be a very important part of the next stage of the policy review.
We mentioned welfare. Stephen mentioned it. And surely that will be one of the big themes, won't it, Stephen? George Osborne thinks he set a trap for Labour with his proposal to limit the increase in welfare benefits to just 1%. But as you mentioned, we know that some Lib Dems are uncomfortable. Is part of your new differentiation strategy, do you think, to portray the Conservatives as extremely right-wing on welfare cuts?
I think you've got a difference, actually, within the Conservative Party itself. If you read Peter Oborne's opinion piece in today's papers talking about the division between Ian Duncan Smith, the Conservative Work and Pensions Secretary, and George Osborne as Chancellor. You see that split emerge. Now, what the Conservatives went into the autumn statement promising was that they wanted to find £10 billion of welfare cuts. Now, the Liberal Democrats at that point put their foot down and said that was a no-go area. You couldn't find those kinds of cuts, even at a time of austerity, which wouldn't really hurt people beyond endurance. So what you've ended up with is a compromise. So you have this cash rise, which is below inflation, so it will squeeze living people's wages hard. But it does pose a problem, definitely, for the Labour Party, because at the moment they're caught between calling for increased benefits, but at the same time recognising a public sector pay freeze. So they're wanting welfare benefits to rise by more than they would want to increase public sector wages. And that's a trap that's been set for them very cleverly.
And Stephen's right. It's a political trap, and that's the problem with it. It's a political trap, not an attempt to actually govern well. So, for instance, last year we saw the reverse of this. We saw a 5% increase in benefits and a freeze on tax credits, which was completely mad. It was an insane policy that made no sense whatsoever. That was actually forced on the government by the Liberal Democrats. We have to find a way through this. The way through it is by creating jobs and employment. That reduces the welfare bill. You do that by creating a short-term demand stimulus. Then, in the next few years, you tighten...
more borrowing.
Well, you tighten...
More borrowing. Labour's answer to every problem is more borrowing.
If you'll let me finish to have an answer that lasts more than 2 seconds, you then have to put in place very stern fiscal rules and a deficit requirement that means that the spending is reduced over time during the period of growth. That's what smart economic fiscal conservatism does. You reduce the deficit during periods of growth, not during recession.
And during the period when we had growth in the last decade, Labour borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. They did not build up a surplus, which is absolutely the opposite of every sound piece of economic advice. Where the coalition's doing on benefits, it isn't just about saving money, which is necessary. It's also about ensuring that work always pays. It's one of the most central and important projects of this coalition, that people in work are better off than on benefits.
Then why did you increase benefits 5% last year?
We did it wrong last year, and we're doing it right for the next 3 years, potentially for the next 6 years if this squeeze goes on. And it is again another sign that Labour are on the wrong side of the public when they are opposing this necessary measure to bring the deficit under control.
Sorry, quick point from you, Stephen.
I just want to say, I think Ed Miliband is trapped here, and and I feel almost sorry for him, because I think you have a situation where Labour's economic legacy is so dire that it puts him in a very difficult position. And the big story in this year, actually, has been how little public opinion has changed, despite all the febrile comment that's been around George Osborne's March budget. When you look at the polling figures, Peter Kellner did a piece on this in the last week or so, talking about it as Groundhog Year. Basically, the figures haven't shifted. Public opinion still blames Labour more than Conservatives for the cuts. They think the cuts are necessary, and they think the economy would have been weaker under Labour. That's the real problem for Ed Miliband.
You mentioned poll ratings. Dismal poll ratings for the Lib Dems.
I set myself up for that one, didn't I?
You did. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to be kind. But bad local election results, terrible performances in the parliamentary by-elections. Your party is disciplined. Few people seem to say that the party should leave the coalition. But there are problems. How on earth can you turn this around?
I think there's 2 points I'd make here. One is that the Liberal Democrats, because they held a special conference back in May 2010, just after the coalition agreement was signed, and there was an overwhelming majority from ordinary party members voting for the coalition, and that support, as you say, has stayed very constant since. We still record 80% approval ratings on our Lib Dem voice surveys. Then there was an agreement. We all dipped our hands in the blood of coalition, which has kept the party united in spite of everything that's happened since.
But unity is being threatened by things like the Secret Courts Bill, isn't it?
Yes.
The Justice and Security Bill. Now, you have been warning today that party loyalty will be stretched to the limit if Nick Clegg fails to get changes to that bill.
The Secret Courts is one of those issues that might seem obscure to people outside, but civil liberties unites the Liberal Democrats. Whilst economic issues occasionally divide, We're united on civil liberties, the protection of the individual against the state or corporate power or whatever else. And the plan for secret courts, which means that individuals wouldn't necessarily hear the evidence against them in civil proceedings, is something that gets to the real core of what it means to be a liberal, which is that you have due process, that you're able to defend yourself against the state. If Nick Clegg doesn't respond to the party will on an issue like secret courts and come out in opposition, then it's the kind of issue that actually could be a trigger point, more so even than bad poll figures.
Hopi, talking about relationship between leader and party, has Ed Miliband surprised you that the party still seems pretty well united under him?
Oh, it's been a very good year for Ed in terms of party support and unity. It's at the start of this year, he was in a difficult position. David Cameron's EU veto poll bounce meant that the Conservatives were pretty much level pegging with us in the polls. There was a sense of uncertainty. We were being attacked internally. What Ed has done this year has got the party pretty much completely united behind him. And
without saying what he'd do.
Well, perhaps that's one of the reasons. But one of the keys to his next success is now that the party unity is secured, and that's a big thing for the Labour Party. We usually kill ourselves after an election defeat. That he's avoided that, I think, is a big feather in his cap. The next challenge is then going to set out a positive agenda that is going to persuade. And from things like One Nation and pre-distribution, he's beginning to set out some policy ideas on there.
Final point to you, Tim. We know about Europe. We know about the gay marriage debate. Lots of problems for David Cameron. Can he pull it round?
Well, it's a difficult challenge for him. I think many Conservatives are also pleased that Ed Miliband is still in place after the last year. Winning the next election is going to be a tough call for the Conservative Party. Neither Margaret Thatcher nor Tony Blair could increase their vote share when they went to the country after their first election. Cameron will have to do something that is exceptionally difficult to increase his vote by 1 to 1.5 million. But Conservatives still believe that with Ed Miliband there as leader and Ed Balls as Shadow Chancellor, we have a chance.
Tim, Stephen, Hopi, thanks very much indeed. Now for this.